So we've talked about decimals. We've talked about how to represent decimals, what they mean. We've talked a little bit about their place value. Now we're going to talk about which decimals are bigger and which decimals are smaller, right? So we've talked about how to look at them. Now we have to talk about how to, order them, right? We need to know how to use them and put them in different places and see which, okay, if I've got more of this or more of that, right? And it's really not that complicated to understand. It just takes a little bit of thinking, right? It takes a little bit of a switch in your thinking to kind of come up with this stuff. Okay, so we talked about how to represent a decimal, right? We've talked about how to show that it's in the tens place. We know how much of a hundredth we have, something like that. In this case, we need to figure out, well, how do we order them? Which ones are bigger? Which ones are smaller? And really, we know how to do whole numbers, right? We know that 5 is smaller, than 6. But what about decimals, right? We're talking about hundredths and thousands and things like that, and it actually seems to go in a different order, right? So let's look at this for a second. I've got a list of numbers here, and I want to put them in order from least to greatest. Okay, least to greatest, meaning I want the smallest on the left over here and the largest on the right. So I'm going to put the smallest numbers on the left and the bigger numbers on the right. Okay. And this is actually a pretty simple process. It's just thinking about how much of something do we have, right? We're going to think about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take these guys. I'm going to write them a little bit differently so that you can see what I'm looking at. And I'm going to order them with their decimal points lined up, and I'm going to do that from top to bottom. I'm not going to put them in necessarily any particular order. I'm just going to take this order and place them on top of each other and line up the decimal point. I'm going to write my whole number so the whole number here for 6.5 in yellow. And then I'm going to let's do blue because that's a contrasting color, the decimal point and the rest of it in blue. So I've got 6.5. Then I've got 6, and I'm lining up that decimal point, 6.56. And I'm being very careful to make sure that they're all lined up in nice and even. That way you can see them row for row, right? So we had 6.56. We've got 5.6, 5.6. And then we've got 5.06, 5.06. Then we've got 5.65, 5. Then we've got 0.65, 0.65. And then we just have 6. Okay. And some of you might be thinking, well, where's the decimal point on this 6? Well, if you look at the rest of them, right, the whole number is on the left. And then at the end of the whole number, there's a little period there. So it's actually just 6 point. And then there's nothing behind it, right? You wouldn't write it like this, but you know where the decimal point is. So let's look at how this is lined up, okay? I've got all my whole numbers in yellow over here, and then I've got all of my decimal points lined up. And then I have their place values, their decimal places lined up as well, right? And then over here, we have the whole numbers. And in this case, we've got the ones place, right? We've got the decimal. And then here we've got the tenths place. And then after that, we've got the hundredths place right there. We've got hundredths, okay? Let me see if I can make that better. Got the... know how to say tenths without making this really small. Got the tenths, there we go, and then the hundredths place right there, right? And obviously there's an nths there, a th. Now, how does this help us, right? What does this do for us? Well, what it does is it allows us to compare the decimal points and see how many we have based on kind of like a counting system. Okay, so I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to fill in every space with a 0. So everything that doesn't really have a space, you see how there's 2 decimal points, right? You've got or decimal places. You've got tenths and hundredths. Anywhere there's a missing number, I'm going to put a 0. So I've got a 0 here, a 0 here, and then there's 2 zeros there because there weren't anything in any spaces, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to order them based on the ones place, the whole number first, and then the decimal. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. I've got 6s and 5s in the ones place. So everything that has a 5 is automatically going to be smaller in this case, because if you go up to 6, right, 6 is greater than anything that's in the 5 realm. Anything that's between 5 and 6 is smaller than anything that's 6 or up, okay, because they're in between. So I'm going to start with things that are 5s here. So I'm not going to worry about the 6s right now. So I've got my 3 5s. Which of the 5s is bigger? Well, if I look at the blue number, I know that 6 out of 60 and 65 is the smallest value, right? So I'm looking at my hundredths place really, and I've got 6 hundredths compared to 60 hundredths and 65 hundredths. Okay, so I know that 6 is my smallest. So my smallest number, let me write that in the original color here. My smallest number, my least is going to be over here. This is my least, is going to be 5 and 6 hundredths. Okay, because it's the smallest. It's the closest to 5, first of all. And then as far as a part of a whole that it has attached to it, it's got the smallest bit. Okay, so 5.06 is the smallest. So this one's done. And then after that, I have to look at my last two. I've got 5.60 or 5 and 6 tenths versus 5 and 65 hundredths, or really 60 hundredths and 65 hundredths. And again, 5.60 or 5 and 60 hundredths is smaller than 5 and 65 hundredths. Okay, so this one is then the next smallest, 5 and 60 hundredths or 5 and 6 tenths. Right? And then obviously the last 5 we have is this 5.65 or 5 and 65 hundredths. So then that would be our next number. Okay, so that's how we're going to do this. I've now got 3 6s. We've got 6 even, 6.50 or 6 and 50 hundredths, and then 6 and 56 hundredths. Again, if I don't have any parts of a whole, right, 6 is going to be my smallest number because it's just a whole number of 6. There's nothing extra there. So my 6 is going to be next, just plain old 6. And then I look at the two numbers here. 50 is smaller than 56. So then I'll have 6 and 5 tenths, 6.5. And then lastly, we have 6.56, or 6 and 56 hundredths. And this is my greatest value. Okay, so you can see that we've ordered them from least to greatest. It's all based on what the original whole number was first, and then you move from place value to place value and compare them and say, okay, which do I have more of? All right, so that's one way you can do it. Now, you can also just look at, just random numbers, right? You can look at 2 decimal points. You don't have to compare 15 of them. Okay, you can just do the 2 of them. Let's say that you had, let's try another color. Let's say that you had 0.2, and I was asking you to compare it with 2.0. Use the same color, 2.0. Now, which one would you choose, right? Well, if we think about it, right, if we do the same thing here, let's look at their whole numbers first, the thing on the left side of the decimal point, because remember, the whole number here is on the left side of the decimal point. I've got a 0 in the whole number place here, the ones place, versus a 2 in the ones place. Which one has more? Well, 2 is always going to be bigger than 0, right? So anything 0.2 and then anything 2 is always going to be greater than anything that has a 0 on it. So I'm going to say that 2 is greater than 0.2, right? You can also think of it as, I don't even have a whole piece here. I've got 2/10 of a whole piece. I've got 1/5 of a whole piece, whereas here I've got 2 whole pieces. That's definitely bigger, right? So that's one number. You could also say you had 2.1, and say you also had 2.10. 2.10. Now, which one of these is bigger, right? Well, let's look. In the ones place, as a whole number, they have the same thing. So they're equal so far. So we don't have to worry about that. If we go to the next place, right, decimal obviously, and then you've got your tenths place at the end, they're still the same. So I don't have to worry about that either. So they're still the same so far. Now, the only thing that you're missing here is on the right side, I've got a 0 in the hundreds place. Over here, I don't have anything. But remember that thing we did where if there wasn't a number here, we could fill it in with a 0. I'm going to do the same thing here to keep comparing them at the place value level. I'm just going to add in a 0 here. And they're still the same. So far, they're the same. If I add a place value here and I'd have to add a 0, and then I'd have to do the same thing here and add a 0, right? They'd still be the same because they're going to continue on with zeros forever. They're actually equal to each other. And that's an interesting thing. If you see the same numbers all the way through and then you start finding zeros at the end, that doesn't change the value. Maybe it has 100 zeros at the end. Maybe this guy on the right side had 50 zeros going down, and this guy was still 2.1. It wouldn't matter because 0 doesn't change your value. It keeps it the same, right? You're not adding anything in. You're just putting in zeros. That doesn't change the value. Therefore, they're equal to each other. So it's all based on how much they have in each place value. They can be the same all the way down, but if they even have like a thousandth, right, that's different, it could change which one's greater or less. Okay, let's try one more just in case. Let's say that we had 5. So we had 5.28, and I'm comparing that to 52.8. Okay, and you could say it 5 and 28 hundredths and 52 and 8 tenths, right? Now, if we look, they have the same numbers. We've got 528, 528. What matters is where this decimal point is. Okay, because let's look at everything on the left side of the decimal point. I've got 5 over here, and then I've got 52 over here. So far, I don't even have to compare the decimals, right? I don't have to compare this 28 and this 8 because 52 is so much greater than 5, right? It's huge compared to 5. So because my whole number is greater, I know that this decimal is going to be much greater than 5.28. If I had 52 and some odd pieces of pi versus 5 and some odd pieces of pi, I'm definitely going to have more with 52, okay? So that's how you compare and order decimals. Make sure that you're always lining them up with a decimal point. Line up the decimal point, just like we did up top. Right here, we lined up the decimal, and then you need to compare them by place value. Okay, actually, you need to fill in the missing zeros. Fill in missing zeros, right? Because if there's nothing there, there's a 0. And then third, you just compare by place value. Okay, and what I mean by place value, right, is not by 0, by place value. What I mean by place value is, right, you start with the whole number, whichever one's bigger, right, obviously is going to be a bigger number regardless, and then you start comparing them by their decimals over here. Whichever one's got the bigger number is going to be bigger, okay? So line up the decimal, fill in the missing zeros, and then compare them by their place value.